Hello, guys. Welcome to Psyched Minds. If you have not subscribed yet, do subscribe, like, and share. I am currently reading We the Living by Anne Rand, chapter 14. A house collapsed early one afternoon. The front wall crashed with a shower of bricks in a white cloud of limey dust. Coming back from work, the inhabitants saw their bedrooms exposed to the cold light of the street like tiers of staged settings, an upright piano caught by a naked beam, hung precariously high over the pavement. There were a few weary moans, but no astonishment. Houses, long since in need of repair, collapsed without warning all over the city. Old bricks were piled high over the tramway rails and stopped traffic. Leo got a job for 2 days clearing the street. He worked bending and rising through many hours, a numb ache in his spine and red dust on bleeding fingers, stiff and raw in cold. The Museum of the Revolution had an exhibition in honor of the visiting delegates of a Swedish trade union. Kira got a job lettering cardboard inscriptions. She bent through 4 long evenings, eyes dull, hands trembling over a ruler, painfully tracing even black letters that said, "Workers starving in the tenements of the capitalist exploiters of 1910. Workers exiled to Siberia by the Czarist gendarmes of 1905. Snow grew in white drifts in the gutters. Under basement windows, Leo shoveled snow for 3 nights, his breath fluttering in spurts of white vapor, icicles sparkling on the old scarf wound tightly around his neck. Citizen of no visible means of support, who owned an automobile and a 5 room apartment, and who held long, whispered conversations with officials of the food trust, decided that his children had to speak French. Kira gave lessons twice a week, dully explaining the passé imparfait to two haggard brats who wiped their noses with their fingers, her voice hoarse, her head swimming, her eyes avoiding the buffet where glossy white muffins sparkled with brown, well buttered crusts. Leo helped a proletarian student who had an examination to pass. He explained slowly the laws of capital and interest to a sleepy fellow who scratched his knuckles, for he had the itch. Kira washed dishes 2 hours a day, bending over a greasy tub that smelt of old fish in a private restaurant until it failed. They disappeared for hours every day, and when they came home, they never asked each other in what lines they had stood, what streets they had trudged wearily to, what doors closed brusquely before them. At night, Kira lighted the Burgoyes and they sat silently, bent over their books. They still had things to study and one goal to remember if all the others had to be forgotten: to graduate. It doesn't matter, Kira had said. Nothing matters. We must not think, we must not think at all. We must remember only that we have to be ready, and then maybe we'll find a way to go abroad. She had not finished. She could not pronounce the word. That word was like a silent, secret wound deep in both of them. Sometimes they read the newspapers. Comrade Zinoviev, president of the Petrograd Soviet, said, "The world revolution is not a matter of years, comrade, not a matter of months, but a matter of days now. The flame of a proletarian uprising will sweep the earth, wiping out forever the curse of world capitalism." There was an there was also an interview with Comrade Biryushin, third stroker on a red battleship. Comrade Biryushin said, "Well, and then we gotta keep the machines oiled, and again we gotta look out for rust, seeing as how it's up to us to watch over the people's engine, and we begin conscientious proletarians. We do our share on account of we don't care for no nonsense outside of good, practical work, and again, there's the foreign burgoyes watching us, and sometimes they read the magazines." Marshall looked at him coldly. "I fear that our ideologies are too far apart. We are born into different social classes. The Vergois prejudices are too deep rooted in your consciousness. I am a daughter of the toiling masses. Individual love is a Burgois prejudice." "Is this the end, Masha?" he asked hoarsely, a death pallor spreading on his handsome but Burgois face. "Yes, Ivan," said she. It's the end. I am the new woman of a new day. There was also poetry to read. My heart is a tractor raking the soil. My soul is smoke from the factory oil. Once they went to a motion picture, it was an American film. In the bright glare of showcases, cluster of shadows stood gazing wistfully at the breathtaking, incredible foreign stills. Big snowflakes crashed into the glass. The eager faces smiled faintly, as with the same thought, the thought that glass and more than glass protected this distant, miraculous world from the hopeless Russian winter. Kira and Leo waited, jammed in the crowd of the foyer. When a show ended and the doors were opened, the crowd tore forward, knocking aside those who tried to come out, squeezing in through the two narrow doors, painfully, furiously, with a brutal despair, like meat ground through a tide grinder. The title of the picture shivered in huge white letters: The Golden Octopus, directed by Reginald Moore, censored by Comrade M. Zawad Kov. The picture was puzzling. It trembled and flickered, showing a hazy office where blurred shadows of people jerked convulsively. An English sign on the office wall was misspelled. The office was that of an American trade union where a stern comrade entrusted the hero, a blondish, dark eyed young man with the recovery of documents of vast importance to the union stolen by a capitalist. Hell, whispered Leo. Do they also make pictures like that in America? Suddenly, as if a fog had lifted, the photography cleared. They could see the soft line of lipstick and every hair of the long lashes of a beautiful, smiling, leading lady. Men and women in magnificently foreign clothes moved gracefully through a story that made no sense. The subtitles did not match the action. The subtitles clamored in glaring white letters about the suffering of our American brothers under the capitalist yoke. On the screen, gay people laughed happily, danced in sparkling halls, ran down sandy beaches, their hair in the wind, the muscles of their young arms taut, glistening monstrously healthy. A woman left her room wearing a white dress and emerged on the street in a black suit. The hero had suddenly grown taller, thinner, very blond and blue-eyed. His trim, full dress suit was surprising on a toil trade union member, and the papers he was seeking through the incoherent jumble of events seemed suspiciously close to something like a will for his uncle's inheritance. A subtitle said, "I hate you. You are a blood sucking capitalist exploiter. Get out of my room." On the screen, a man was bending over the hand of a delicate lady, pressing it slowly to his lips, while she looked at him sadly and gently stroked his hair. The end of the picture was not shown. It finished abruptly as if torn off. A subtitle concluded, "6 months later, the bloodthirsty capitalist met his death at the hand of striking workers. Our hero renounced the joys of a selfish love into which the bourgeois siren had tried to lure him, and he dedicated his life to the cause of the world revolution." "I know," said Kira, when they were leaving the theatre. "I know what they have done. They have shot that beginning here themselves. They have cut the picture to pieces." An usher who heard her chuckled. Sometimes the doorbell rang and the Upravdom came in to remind them of the house meeting of all the tenants on an urgent matter. He said, "No exceptions, citizens. Social duty comes above all. Every tenant gotta attend the meeting." Then Kira and Leo filed into the largest room of the house, a long bare room with one electric bulb in the ceiling, in the apartment of a streetcar conductor who had offered it graciously for the social duty. Tenants came bringing their own chair and sat chewing sunflower seeds. Those who brought no chair sat on the floor and chewed sunflower seeds. "Seeing as how I am the Upravdom," said the Upravdom, "I declare this meeting of the tenants of the house number on Sergivskaya Street open. On the order of the day is the question as regards the chimneys. Now, comrade citizens, seeing as how we are all responsible citizens and conscious of the proper class consciousness, we gotta understand that this isn't the old days when we had landlords and didn't care what happened to the house we lived in. Now, this is different, comrades. Owing to the new regime and the dictatorship of the proletariat, and seeing as how the chimneys are clogged, we gotta do something about it, seeing as how we are the owners of the house. Now, if the chimneys are clogged, we'll have the house full of smoke. And if we have the house full of smoke, it's sloppy, and if we are sloppy, that's not true proletarian discipline. And so, comrade citizens, housewife fidgeted nervously, sniffing the odor of burning food. A fat man in red shirt was twiddling his thumbs. A young man with a mouth hanging open was scratching his head. And the special assessment will be divided in proportion to the. Is that you, Comrade Kira Organova? Trying to sneak out? Well, you better don't. You know what we think of people that sabotage their social duties. And special assessment will be divided in proportion to the social standing of the tenants. The workers pay 3% and the free professions 10, and the private traders and unemployed the rest. Who's for? Raise your hands. Comrade Secretary, count the citizen's hand. Who's against? Raise your hands. Comrade Michiluk, you can't raise your hand for and against on the one and same proposition. Victor's visit was unexpected and inexplicable. He stretched his hands to the Burgoys, rubbed them energetically, smiled cheerfully at Kira and Leo. Just passing by and thought I would drop in. It's a charming place you have here. Irina's been telling me about it. She's fine, thank you. No, mother's not so well. The doctor said there's nothing he can do if we don't send her south. And who can think of affording a trip these days? Been busy at the institute, re-elected to Students' Council. Do you read poetry? Just read some verses by a woman. Exquisite delicacy of feelings. Yes, it's a loving place you have here. Pre-revolutionary luxury. You two are quite the Burgoys, aren't you? Two huge rooms like these, no trouble with the domicile norm? We have had two tenants forced upon us last week. One's a communist, father's just gritting his teeth. Irina has to share her room with Asha and they fight like dogs. What can one do? People have to have a roof over their heads. Yes, Petrograd is an overcrowded city. Petrograd certainly is. She came in, a red bandana on her hair, streaks of powder on her nose, a bundle tied in a white sheet in her hand, one black stocking hanging out of the bundle. She asked, "Where's the drawing room?" Kira asked, startled. "What do you want, citizen?" The girl did not answer. She opened the first door she saw, which led to the tenant's room. She slammed it shut. She opened the other door and walked into the drawing room. "That's it," she said. "You can get your burgoys out and your dishes and other trash. I have my own." "What do you want, citizen?" Kira repeated. "Oh, yes," said the girl. "Here." She handed to Kira a crumpled scrap of paper with a big official stamp. It was an order from the Gilotel, giving citizen Marina Lavrova the right to occupy the room known as drawing room in apartment number 22, house number on Sergiyevskaya Street. It requested the present occupants to vacate the room immediately, removing only personal effects of immediate necessity. "Why, it's impossible!" Kira gasped. The girl laughed. "Get going, citizen, get going." "Listen, you, get out of here peacefully. You won't get this room." "No? Who's going to stop me?" "You?" She walked to a chair, saw Kira's apron on it, threw it to the floor and put her bundle on the chair. Slamming the door behind her, Kira raced up the stairs, 3 floors up, to the Apravdom's apartment and stood panting, knocking at the door ferociously. The Apravdom opened the door and listened to her story, frowning. "Order from the Gilotel," he said. "That's funny, they didn't notify me. That's irregular. I'll put the citizen in her proper place." Comrade Opravdom, you know very well it's against the law. Citizen Kovalinsky and I are not married. We are entitled to separate rooms." "You sure are." Kira had been paid for a month and of the lessons the day before. She took the little roll of bills from her pocket and without looking at it, without counting, thrust it all into Opravdom's hand. "Comrade Opravdom, I'm not in the habit of begging for help, but please, oh please get her out. It would simply mean the end for us." The Apravdom slipped the bills into his pocket furtively, then looked straight at Kira, openly and innocently, as if nothing had happened. "Don't you worry, citizen Argonova. We know our duty. We'll fix the lady. We'll throw her out on her behind in the gutter where she belongs." He slammed his hat over one ear and followed Kira's downstairs. "Look here, citizen, what's all this about?" the Apravdom asked sternly. Citizen Marina Lavrova had taken her coat off and opened her bundle. She wore a tailored white shirt, an old skirt, a necklace of imitation pearls, and slippers with very high heels. She had piled underwear, books, and teapot in a jumble on the table. "How do you do, Comrade Apravdom?" She smiled pleasantly. "We might as well get acquainted." She took a little wallet from her pocket and handed it to him. Open, showing a little card. It was a membership card of the Communist Union of Youth, the Komsomol. Oh, said the Apravdom. Oh. He turned to Kira. What do you want, citizen? You have 2 rooms and you want a toiling girl to be thrown out on the street? The time is past for Burgoy's privileges, citizens. People like you had better watch their step. Kira and Leo appealed the case in the People's Court. They sat in a bare room that smelt of sweat and of an upswept floor. Lenin and Karl Marx, without frames bigger than life size, looked at them from the wall. A cotton strip said, Proletarian of the rest was not to be seen, for the end of the strip had become untagged and swayed, curled like a snake in a draught. The president magistrate yawned and asked Kira, What's your social position, citizen? Student? Employed? No. Member of a trade union? No. The Apravdom testified that although Citizen Argonova and Citizen Kovalensky were not in the state of legal matrimony, their relations are those of sexual intimacy. There being only one bed in their room, of which he, the Apravdom, had made certain, and which made them for all purpose same as married, and the domicile norm allowed but 1 room to a married couple, as the comrade judge well knew. Furthermore, the room known as drawing room, together with their bedroom, gave the citizens in question 3 square feet of living space over the prescribed norm. Furthermore, the citizens in question had been of late quite irregular about their rent. Who was your father, Citizen Argonova? Alexander Argonova, the former textile manufacturer and factory owner. Yes, I see. Who was your father, Citizen Kovalensky? Admiral Kovalensky. Executed for counter-revolutionary activities? Executed, yes. Who was your father, Citizen Lavrova? Factory worker, comrade judge. Exiled to Siberia by the Czar in 1913. My mother's peasant from the plough. It is the verdict of the People's Court that the room in question rightfully belongs to Citizen Lavrova. Is this a court of justice or a musical comedy? Leo asked. The presiding magistrate turned to him solemnly. So-called impartial justice, citizen, is a Burgoy's prejudice. This is a court of class justice. It is our official attitude and platform. Next case. Comrade Judge, how about the furniture? Our furniture, Kira appealed. You can't pull all that furniture into 1 room. No, but we could sell it. We're quite hard up. So? You would sell it for profit, and a proletarian girl who didn't happen to accumulate any furniture would have to sleep on the floor? Next case. Tell me one thing, Skira asked Citizen Lavrova. How did you happen to get an order for that particular room of ours? Who told you about it? Citizen Lavrova gave an abrupt giggle with a vague stare. One has friends, was all she answered. She had a pale face with a short nose and small spouting lips that looked chronically discontented. She had light, bluish eyes, cold and suspicious, her hair curled in vague ringlets on her forehead, and she always wore tiny earrings, a brass circle close around the lobe of her ear. With a tiny imitation turquoise, she was not sociable and talked little, but the doorbell rang continuously in the hands of visitors to Comrade Lavrova. Her friends called her Marisha. In Leo's grey and silver bedroom, a hole was pierced over the black onyx fireplace for the pipe of the Burgoyes. 2 shelves on his wardrobe were emptied for dishes, silverware, and food. Breadcrumbs rolled down into their underwear, and the bed sheets smelt of linseed oil. Leo's books were stacked on the dresser, Kira's under the bed. Leo whistled a foxtrot. Arranging his books, Kira did not look at him. After some hesitation, Marisha surrendered the painting of Leo's mother, which hung in the drawing room, but she kept the frame. She put a picture of Lenin in it. She also had pictures of Trotsky, Marx, Engels, and Rosa Luxemburg, also a poster representing the spirit of the Red Air Fleet. She had a gramophone. Late into the night, she played old records, of which her favorite was a song about Napoleon's defeat in Russia. It roared, it flamed, the fire of Moscow. When she was tired of the gramophone, she played the Dog's Waltz on the grand piano. The bathroom had to be reached through the bedroom. Marisha kept shuffling in and out, wearing a faded, unfastened bathrobe. When you have to go through, I wish you would knock, Kira told her. What for? It's not your bathroom. Marisha was a student of the university RAPVAC, The RAPFACs were special workers faculties with an academic program a little less exacting than that of a university, with a program of revolutionary sciences a great deal more exacting, and with an admission on the strictest proletarian basis. Marisha disliked Kira, but spoke to Leo at times. She flung the door open so that her posters rustled on the walls and yelled imperiously, "Citizen Walensky, can you help me with this damn French history? What century did they burn Martin Luther in? Or was that Germany? Or did they burn him?" At other times, she flung the door open and announced to no one in particular, "I'm going to the Comsol club to meeting. If Comrade Rilenko comes, tell him he'll find me at the club. But if that louse Mishka Gvozdev comes, tell him I have gone to America. You know who he is, that little one with the warts on his nose." She came in, a cup in her hand. "Citizen Argonova, can I borrow some lard? Didn't know I was all out of it. Nothing but linseed oil. How can you eat that stinking stuff? Well, give me half a cup." Going out at 7 in the morning, passing through her room, Leo found Marisha asleep, her head on a table littered with books. Marisha jerked, awakening with a start at the sound of his steps. "Oh, damnation!" she yawned, stretching. "It's this paper I have to read at the Marxist Circle tonight for our less enlightened comrades on the social significance of electricity as a historical factor. Citizen Kovalensky, who the hell is Edison?" Late at night, they could hear her coming home. She slammed the door and threw her books on a chair, and they could hear the books scattering over the floor, and her voice intermingled with the deep, adolescent basso of Comrade Rilenko. "Aleshka, pal, be an angel. Light that damn Primus, I'm starving." Aleshka's steps shuffled across the room, and the Primus hissed, "You're an angel, Aleshka. Always said you were an angel. I'm tired like a dray horse. The RAPFAC this morning, the Comsol Club at noon, a committee on day nurseries in factories at 1:30, the Marxist Circle at 2, demonstration against illiteracy at 3, and do my feet sweat. Lecture on electrification at 4. At 7, editor's board of the Wall newspaper. I'm going to be editor. Meeting of the women house workers at 7:30 or something. Conference on our comrade in Hungary at... You can't say your girlfriend ate class-minded and socially active, Aleshka. You really can't say it." Aleshka sat at the piano and played John Gray. Once in the middle of the night, Kira was awakened by someone slinking furtively into the bathroom. She caught a glimpse of an undressed boy with blonde hair. There was no light in Marisha's room. One evening, Kira heard a familiar voice behind the door. A man was saying, "Of course, we are friends. You know we are. Perhaps there's more on my part, but I do not dare to hope. I've proven my devotion to you. You know the favor I've done to you. I done for you. Now do one for me. I want to meet that party friend of yours." Passing through Marisha's room, on her way out, Kira stopped short. She saw Victor sitting on the davenport, holding Marisha's hand. He jumped up, his temples reddened. "Victor, were you coming to see me or..." Her voice broke off. She understood. "Kira, I don't want you to think that I..." Victor was saying. Kira was running out of the room, out of the lobby, down the stairs. When she told Leo about it, he threatened to break every bone in Victor's body. She begged him to keep quiet. "If you raise this issue, his father will know. It will break Uncle Vasily, and he's so unhappy as it is. What's the use? We won't get the room back." In the Institute Cooperative, Kira met Comrade Sonia and Pavel Syrov. Comrade Sonia was chewing a crust of bread broken off the loaf she had received. Pavel Syrov looked at trim as trim as a military fashion plate. He smiled effusively. "How are you, Comrade Argonova? We don't see you so often at the Institute these days." "I've been busy." "We don't see you with Comrade Taganov anymore. You two haven't quarreled, have you?" "Why does that interest you?" "Oh, it's of no particular interest to me personally." "But it does interest us as a party member," Comrade Sonia remarked sternly. "Comrade Taganov is a valuable party worker. Naturally, we are concerned for his friendship with a woman of your social origin might hurt his party standing." "Nonsense, Sonia, nonsense," Pavel Syrov protested with sudden eagerness. "Andrei's party standing is too high. Nothing can hurt it. Comrade Argonova doesn't have to worry and break off a lovely friendship." Kira looked at him fixedly and asked, "But his party standing does worry you because it's so high, doesn't it?" "Why, Comrade Taganov is a very good friend of mine, and are you a very good friend of his?" "A peculiar question, Comrade Argonova. One does hear peculiar things nowadays, doesn't one? Good day, Comrade Syrov." Marisha came in when Kira was alone. Her little pouting mouth was swollen, her eyes were red, swollen with tears. She asked sullenly, Citizen Argonova, what do you use to keep from having children? Kira looked at her, startled. I'm afraid I'm in trouble, Marisha wailed. It's that damn Lausaleshka Rilenko. Said I would be Burgoyes if I didn't let him. Said he would be careful. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? Kira said she didn't know. For 3 weeks, Kira worked secretly on a new dress. It was only her old dress, but slowly, painfully, awkwardly, she managed to turn it inside out. The blue wool was smooth and silky on the inside. It looked almost fresh. It was to be her surprise for Leo. She worked on it at night when he had gone to bed. She put a candle on the floor and opened the big mirror door of the wardrobe and used it as a screen, crouching on the floor behind it by the candle. She had never learned how to sew. Her fingers moved slowly, helplessly. She wiped drops of blood on her petticoat. When she pricked her finger with the needle, her eyes felt as if tiny needles pricked them continuously from behind the lids, and her lids felt so heavy that when she blinked, they and stayed closed, and it took an effort to pull them open to the huge yellow glare of the candle. Somewhere in the darkness, behind the yellow glare, Leo breathed heavily in his sleep. The dress was ready on the day when she met Wawa in the street. Wawa was smiling happily, mysteriously once in a while, for no apparent reason, smiling at a secret thought of her own. They walked home together and Wawa could not resist it any longer. Won't you come in, Kira? She begged. For just a second. I have something to show you, something from abroad. Wawa's room smelt of perfume and clean linen. A big teddy bear with a big pink bow sat on the white lace covered of her bed. Wawa opened a parcel carefully. Wrapped in tissue paper, she handled the objects inside with a frightened reverence with delicate, trembling fingers. The parcel contained 2 pairs of silk stocking and a black celluloid bracelet. Kira gasped. She extended her hand. She hesitated. She touched her stocking with her fingertips, caressing it timidly like the fur of a priceless animal. It's smuggled, Wawa whispered. A lady, father's patient, her husband's in the business, they smuggled it for Riga. And the bracelet, that's their latest fashion abroad. Imagine, fake jewelry, isn't it fascinating? Kira held the bracelet reverently on the palm of her hand. She did not dare to slip it on. Wawa asked suddenly, timidly, without smiling. Kira, how's Victor? He's fine. I haven't seen him for some time. Well, I know he's so busy. I have given up all my dates, waiting for him to. Oh well, he's such an active person. I'm so happy over these stockings. I'll wear them when he comes. I just had to throw out my last silk pair this morning. You threw them out? Why, yes, I think they are still in the waste basket. They are ruined. One has a big run in the back. Wawa, can I have them? What? The torn ones? But they are no good. It's just for a joke. Kira went home, clutching a soft little ball in her pocket. She kept her hand in her pocket. She could not let it go. When Leo came in that evening, his hand opened the door and flung his briefcase into the room. The briefcase opened, spilling the books over the floor. Then he came in. He did not take his coat off. He walked straight to the Burgoyes and stood, his blue hands extended to the fire, rubbing them furiously. Then he took his coat off and threw it across the room at a chair. It missed the chair and fell to the floor. He didn't pick it up. Then he asked, Anything to eat? Kira stood facing him, silent, motionless in the splendor of her new dress and carefully mended real silk stocking. She said softly, Yes, sit down. Everything is ready. He sat down. He had looked at her several times. He had not noticed it was the same old blue dress but she had trimmed it carefully with bands and buttons of black oilcloths, which looked almost like patent leather. When she served the millet and he dipped his spoon hungrily into the steaming yellow mush, she stood by the table and, raising her skirt a little, swung her leg forward into the circle of light, watching happily the shimmering tight silk. She said timidly, Leo, look. He looked and asked curtly, Where did you get them? Wawa gave them to me. They were torn. I wouldn't wear other people's discarded junk. He did not mention the new dress. She did not call it to his attention. They ate silently. Marisha had had an abortion. She moaned behind the closed door. She shuffled heavily across the room, cursing aloud the midwife who did not know her business. Citizen Lavrova, will you please clean the room? Clean the bathroom. There's blood all over the floor. Leave me alone, I'm sick. Clean it yourself if you're so damn burgoyes about your bathroom. Marisha slammed the door, then opened it again cautiously. Citizen Argonova, you won't tell your cousin on me, will you? He doesn't know about my trouble. He's a gentleman. Leo came home at dawn. He had worked all night. He had worked in a casino, caissons for a bridge under construction, deep on the bottom of a river on the point of freezing. Kira had waited for him. She had kept a fire in the Burgoyes. He came in, oil and mud on his coat, oil and sweat on his face, oil and blood on his hands. He swayed a little and held onto the door. A strand of hair was glued across his forehead. He went into the bathroom. He came out asking, Kira, do I have to have any clean underwear? He was naked. His hands were swollen. His head dropped to one shoulder. His eyelids were blue. His body was white as marble and as hard and straight, the body of a god, she thought, that should climb a mountainside at dawn, young grass under his feet, a morning mist on his muscles in a breath of homage. The Burgoyes was smoking. An acrid fog hung under the electric bulb. The grey rug under his feet smelt of kerosene. Black drops of soot fell slowly, with a soft thud from a joint of the stove pipes to the grey rug. Kira stood before him. She could say nothing. She took his hand and raised it to her lips. He swayed a little. He threw his head back and coughed. Leo was late. He had been detained at a university lecture. Kira waited, the Primus hissing feebly, keeping his dinner hot. The telephone rang. She heard a child's voice, trembling, panicky, gulping tears between words. Is that you, Kira? It's Ashia. Kira, please come over immediately, right away. I'm scared. There's something wrong. I think it's mother. There's no one home but father, and he won't call and he won't speak, and I'm scared. There's nothing to eat in the house. Please, Kira, I'm so scared. Please come over. Please, Kira. With all the money she had, Kira brought a bottle of milk and 2 pounds of bread in a private store on her way over. Ashia opened the door. Her eyes were slits in a purple, swollen face. She grabbed Kira's skirt and sobbed dully, convulsively, her shoulders shaking, her nose buried in Kira's hem. Ashia, what happened? Where's Irina? Where is Victor? Victor's not home. Irina's gone for the doctor. I called the tenant and he said to get the hell out. I'm scared. Vasily Ivanovich sat by his wife's bed. His hand hung limply between his knees and he did not move. Maria Petrovna's hair was spilled over the white pillow. She breathed, hissed, the white coverlet rising and falling jerkily. On the white coverlet there was a wide dark stain. Kira stood helplessly, clutching the milk bottle in one hand, the bread in the other. Vasily Ivanovich raised his head slowly and looked at her. Kira, he said indifferently. Milk. Would you mind heating it? It might help. Kira found the Primus. She heated the milk. She held a cup to the trembling blue lips. Maria Petrovna swallowed twice and pushed the cup away. Hemorrhage, said Vasily Ivanovich. Irina's gone for the doctor. He has no phone. No other doctor will come. I have no money. The hospital won't send anyone. We are not trade union members. A candle burned on the table through a sickly yellow haze, a dusty fog more than a light. 3 tall, bare, curtainless windows stared like black gashes. A white pitcher lay upturned on a table, slowly dripping a few last drops into a dark puddle on the floor. A yellow circle shivered on the ceiling over the candle, and a yellow glow shivered on Maria Petrovna's hand as if her skin were trembling. Maria Petrovna whined softly. I'm all right. I'm all right. I know I'm all right. Vasily just wants to frighten me. No one can say I'm not all right. I want to live. I will live. Who said I won't live? Of course you will, Aunt Marussia. You're all right. Just lie still. Relax. Kira, where's my nail buffer? Find my nail buffer. Irina's lost it again. I told her not to touch it. Where's my nail buffer? Kira opened a drawer in search of the buffer. A sound stopped her. It was like pebbles rolling on a hard floor, like water gurgling through a clogged pipe, and like an animal howling. Maria Petrovna was coughing. A dark froth ran down her white chin. Ice, Kira, Vasily Ivanovich cried. Have we any ice? She ran, stumbling down at the dark corridor to the kitchen. A thick coating of ice was frozen over the edge of the sink. She broke some off with the sharp, rusty blade of an old knife, cutting her hands. She came back, running, water dripping from the ice between her fingers. Maria Petrovna howled, coughing. Help me! Help me! Help me! They rolled the ice into a towel and put it on her chest. Red stains spread on her nightgowns. Suddenly she jerked herself up. The ice rolled, clattering to the floor. A long pink strand of froth hung on her lower lip. Her eyes were wide with a horror beyond all human dignity. She was staring at Kira. She screamed, Kira, I want to live! I want to live! She fell back. Her hair jerked like snakes on the pillow and lay still. Her arms fell over the edge of the bed and lay still. A red bubble grew over her open mouth and burst in a spurt of something black and heavy, gurgling like the last drop through the clogged pipe. She did not move. Nothing moved on the bed but the blacks that slithered slowly down the skin of her throat. Kira stood still. Someone seized her hand. Vasily Ivanovich buried his face in her hip and sobbed. He sobbed without a sound. She saw the grey hair shaking on his neck. Behind a chair in a corner, Asya crouched on the floor and whined softly, monotonously. Kira did not cry. When she came home, Leo was sitting by the primus heating her dinner. He was coughing. They sat at a small table in a dark corner of the restaurant. Kira had met Andre at the institute and he had invited her for a cup of tea with real French pastry. The restaurant was almost empty from the sidewalk outside. A few faces stared through the window, dull, incredulous faces, watching those who could afford to sit in a restaurant. At a table in the center, a man in a huge fur coat was holding a dish of pastry for a smiling woman who hesitated in her choice, her fingers fluttering over the glistening chocolate frosting. A diamond glistening on her finger. The restaurant smelt of old rubber and stale fish. A long sticky paper tube dangled from the central chandelier, brown with glue, black dotted with dead flies. The tube swayed every time the kitchen door was opened. Over the kitchen door hung a picture of Lenin, trimmed with boughs of red crepe paper. Kira, I almost broke my word. I was going to call on you. I was worried. I still am. You look so pale. Anything wrong, Kira? Some trouble at home. I had tickets for the ballet, Swan Lake. I waited for you, but you missed all your lectures. I'm sorry. Was it beautiful? I didn't go. Andre, I think Pavel Syrov is trying to make trouble for you in the party. He probably is. I don't like Pavel Syrov. While the party is fighting speculators, he patronizes them. He's been known to buy a foreign sweater from a smuggler. Andre, why doesn't your party believe in the right to live while one is not killed? Do you mean Syrov or yourself? Myself? In our fight, Kira, there is no neutrality. You may claim the right to kill, as all fighters do, but no one before you has ever thought of forbidding life of those still living. She looked at the pitiless face before her. She saw two dark triangles in the sunken cheeks. The muscles of his face were taut. He was saying, when one can stand any suffering, one can also see others suffer. This is martial law. Our time is dawn. There is a new sun rising, such as the world has never seen before. We are in the path of its first rays. Every pain, every cry of ours will be carried by these rays as on a gigantic radius. Down the centuries, every little figure will grow into an enormous shadow that will wipe out decades of future sorrow for every minute of ours. The waiter brought the tea and pastry. There was a convulsive little jerk in Kira's fingers as she raised a piece of pastry into her mouth, an involuntary frightened hurry which was not mere greed or a rare delicacy. Kira, Andre gasped and dropped his fork. Kira! She stared at him, frightened. Kira, why didn't you tell me? Andre, I don't know what you're talking about. She tried to say, but knew what he had guessed. Wait, don't eat that. Waiter! A bowl of hot soup right away. Then dinner, everything you have. Hurry, Kira, I didn't know it was that bad. She smiled feebly, helplessly. I tried to find work. Why didn't you tell me? I know you don't believe in using party influence to help friends. Oh, but this, Kira, this. It was the first time she had ever seen him frightened. He jumped up. Excuse me a moment. He strode across the room to a telephone. She could hear splinters of conversation. Comrade Voronov? Urgent. Andrei Taganov. Conference? Interrupted. Comrade Voronov? Who has to be? Immediately. Yes. I don't care. Make one. Yes. No, no. Tomorrow morning. Yes. Thank you, comrade. Goodbye. Andre came back to the table. He smiled down at her startled, incredulous face. Well, you go to work tomorrow in the office of the House of the Peasant. It's not very much of a job, but it's one I could get for you right away, and it won't be hard. Be there at 9. As for Comrade Voronov, he will know who you are, and here. He opened his wallet and, emptying it, pressed a roll of bills onto into her hand. Oh, Andre, I can't. Well, maybe you can't for yourself, but you can for someone else. Isn't there someone at home who needs it? Your family? She thought of someone at home who needed it. She took the money. That brings us to the end of chapter 14. Just. Chapter 15. When Kira slept, her head fell back on the pillow so that the faint starlight outside made a white triangle under her chin. Her lashes lay still on pale, calm cheeks. Her lips breathed softly, half open like a child's, with a hint of a smile in the corners, trusting and expectant, timid and radiantly young. The alarm clock rang at 6:30 a.m. It had been ringing at 6:30 a.m. for the last 2 months. Her first movement of the day was a convulsive leap into an icy precipice. She seized the alarm clock after its first hysterical shriek and turned it off to let Leo sleep, then stood swaying, shivering, the sound of the alarm still ringing in her ears like an insult, a dark hatred in her body, a cry rising in every muscle like the pain of a great illness, calling her back into bed, her head too heavy for her body, the cold floor like fire under her bare feet. Then she staggered blindly, groping in the darkness into the bathroom. Her eyes wouldn't open. She reached for the bathtub faucet. It had been running slowly, gurgling in the darkness all night. It had to be left running on the pipes would freeze. It had to be left running or the pipes would freeze. Eyes closed, she slapped cold water over her face with one hand. With the other, she leaned unsteadily on the edge of the bathtub to keep from falling forward head first. Then her eyes opened and she pulled her nightgown off. Steam rising from her wet arms in the frozen air, while she tried to smile, her teeth chattering, telling herself that she was awake now and the worst was over. She dressed and slipped back into the bedroom. She did not turn on the light. She could see the black silhouette of the Primus on the table against the dark blue of the window. She struck a match, her body shielding the bed from the light flare of light. She pumped the handle nervously. The Primus wouldn't light. The clock ticked in the darkness, the precious fleeting seconds hurrying her on. She pumped furiously, biting her lips. The blue flame sprang up at last. She put a pan of water over the flame. She drank tea with saccharine and chewed slowly a piece of dry bread. The window before her was frozen into a solid pattern of white ferns that sparkled softly. Beyond the window it was still night. She sat huddled by the table, afraid to move, trying to chew without a sound. Leo slept restlessly. He turned uneasily. He coughed, a dry, choking cough smothered by the pillow. He sighed once in a while in his sleep, a raucous sigh that was almost a moan. She pulled on her felt boots, her winter coat, wound wound an old scarf around her throat. She tiptoed to the door, threw a last glance at the pale blue in the darkness that was Leo's face, and brushed her lips with her fingertips in a soundless kiss. Then she opened the door very slowly and as slowly closed it again behind her. The snow was still blue outside. Above the roofs, the blue darkness receded in circles so that far away down the sky one could guess a paler blue if one looked hard. Somewhere beyond the houses, a tramway shrieked like an early bird of prey. Kira bent forward, gathered her hand into her armpits. In a tight, shivering huddle against the wind, the cold caught her breath with a sharp pain in her nostrils. She ran, slipping on the frozen sidewalk, towards the distant tramway. A line waited for the tramway. She stood, bent to the wind and silent as the others. When the tramway came, yellow squares of light in spaces shaking towards them through the darkness, the line broke. There was a swift whirlpool at the narrow door. A rustle of crushed bodies, the yellow squares of lighted windows filled speedily with shadows, pressed tightly together, and Kira was left outside as the bell rang and the tramway tore forward. There was half an hour to wait for the next one. She would be late. If she were late, she would be fired. She ran after the tramway, leaped, caught a brass handle, but there was no room on speed. Someone's strong arm seized her shoulder blade and pulled her up. Her one foot found space on the steps. A hoarse voice roared into her ear. You insane citizen! That's how so many get killed. She hung in a cluster of men on the tramway steps, holding on with one hand and one foot, watching the streaked snow speed by on the ground, pressing herself with all her strength into the cluster of bodies when a passing truck came too close and threatened to grind her off the tramway steps. The house of the peasant occupied someone's former mansion. It had a stairway of pale pink marble with a frozen balustrade, lighted by a huge stained glass window where purple grapes and pink peaches rolled out of golden cornucopias. A sign was posted over the stairs. Comrades, do not spit on the floor. There was other sign. There were other signs, a huge sickle and hammer of gilded papier-mâché, a poster with a peasant woman and a sheaf of wheat, more posters of sheaves, golden sheaves, green sheaves, red sheaves, a picture of Lenin, a peasant riding underfoot, a spider with the head of a priest, a picture of Trotsky, a peasant and a red tractor, a picture of Karl Marx. Proletarians of the world, unite. Who does not toil shall not eat. Long live the reign of workers and poor peasants. Comrade peasants, crush the hoarders in your midst. A new movement had been started in a blare of newspaper and posters for a closer understanding between workers and peasants, a wider spread of city ideas through the country, a movement called the clamping of city and village. The house of the peasant was dedicated to such clamping. There were posters of workers and peasants shaking hands, of a worker and a peasant woman, also of a peasant and a working woman, of workbench and plough, of smokestacks and wheat fields. Our future lies in the clamping of city and village. Comrades, strengthen the clamping. Comrades, do your share for the clamping. Comrades, what have you done for the clamping? The posters rose like foam from the entrance door up the stairway to the office. In the office there were carved marbles, columns and partitions of unpainted wood, also desks, files, pictures of proletarian leaders and typewriter, also Comrade Bityuk, the office manager, and 5 office workers, among them Kira Argonova. Comrade Bityuk was a tall woman, thin, grey-haired, military, and in strict sympathy with the Soviet government. Her chief aim in life was to give constant evidence of how strict that sympathy was, even though she had graduated from a women's college and wore on her breast an old-fashioned watch on a bow of burnished silver. Her 4 office workers were a tall girl with a long nose and a leather jacket who was a party member and could make Comrade Bityuk shudder at her slight whim and knew it. A young man with a bad complexion who was not a party member yet but had made an application and was a candidate and never missed a chance to mention it, and 2 young girls who worked merely because they needed the wages, Nina and Tina. Nina wore earrings and answered the telephone. Tina powdered her nose and ran the typewriter. A habit which had sprung from nowhere and spread over the country, which even party members could not check or resist, for which no one was responsible nor could be punished, referred to all products of local inefficiency as Soviet. There were Soviet matches that did not light, Soviet kerchiefs that tore the first time worn, Soviet shoes with cardboard soles. Young women like Nina and Tina were called Soviet girls. There were many floors and many offices in the house of the peasant. Many feet hurried up and down its many corridors in a steady drone of activity. Kira never learned just what that activity was, nor who worked in the building, besides those in her office and the imposing Comrade Voronov, whom she had seen once on her first day in the house of the peasant. As Comrade Bitiuk reminded them constantly, the house of the peasant was the heart of a gigantic net whose veins poured the beneficial light of the new proletarian culture into the darkest corners of our farthest villages. It represented the hospitable arms of the city, who opened wide in welcome to all peasant delegations, all comrades from the villages who came to the city. It stood there as their guide and teacher, as the devoted servant of their cultural and spiritual needs. From her desk, Kira watched Comrade Bitiuk gushing into the telephone. Yes, comrade, it's all arranged. At 1 o'clock, the comrade peasants of the Siberian delegation go to the Museum of the Revolution, the history of the revolutionary movement from its first days, an easy visualized course in the proletarian history. Within 2 hours, very valuable, and we have made arrangements for a special guide. At 3 o'clock, the comrade peasants go to our Marxist club, where we have arranged a special lecture on the problems of the Soviet city and village. At 5 o'clock, the comrade peasants are expected at a club of the pioneers, where the children have called a special meeting in their honor. There will be a display of physical culture drills by the dear little tots. At 7 o'clock, the comrade peasants go to the opera. We have reserved 2 boxes at the Marinsky Theatre, where they will hear Aida. When Comrade Bitiuk hung up the receiver, she whirled around in her chair, snapping a military command. Comrade Aragonova, do you have the requisition for the special lecturer? No, Comrade Bitiuk. Comrade Ivanovna, have you typed that requisition? What requisition, Comrade Bit? That requisition for the special lecturer for the delegation of the comrade peasant from Siberia? But you didn't tell me to type any requisition, Comrade Bitiuk. I wrote it myself and put it on your desk. Oh yes, sure. Oh, that's what it was for. Oh well, I saw it, but I didn't know I was to type it, Comrade Bitiuk, and my typewriter ribbon is torn. Comrade Argonova, do you have the approved requisition for a new typewriter ribbon for Comrade Ivanovna's typewriter? No, Comrade Bitiuk. Where is it? In Comrade Voronov's office. What is it doing there? Comrade Voronov hasn't signed it yet. Have the others signed? Yes, Comrade Bitiuk, Comrade Semenov has signed it, and Comrade Vlasova and Comrade Pereverstov, but Comrade Voronov has not returned it yet. Some people do not realize the tremendous cultural importance of the work we are doing, Comrade Bitiuk raged, but noticing the cold, suspicious stare of the girl in the leather jacket, who heard this criticism of a higher official, she hastened to correct herself. I meant you, Comrade Argonova. You do not show sufficient interest in your work, nor any proletarian consciousness. It's up to you to see that this requisition is signed. Yes, Comrade Bitiuk. Through the hours, thin and pale in her faded dress, Kira filed documents, typewritten documents, certificates, reports, accounts, requisitions that had to be filed where no one ever looked at them again. She counted books, columns of books, mountains of books, fresh from the printers, ink staining her fingers, books in red and white papers, covers to be sent to peasant clubs all over the country. What you can do for the clamping, the red peasant, the workbench, and the plough, the ABC of communism, Comrade Lenin and Comrade Marx. There were many telephone calls, there were many people coming in and going out to be called comrades and citizens. There were many times to repeat mechanically like a well-wound gramophone, imitating Comrade Bitiuk's enthusiastic inflations. Thus, comrade, you will be doing your share for the clamping, and the cultural progress of the proletariat, comrade, requires that. Sometimes a comrade peasant came into the office in person. He stood behind the low, unpainted partition, timidly crumpling his fur cap in one hand, scratching his head with the other. He nodded slowly, his bewildered eyes staring at Kira without comprehension as she told him, "And we have arranged an excursion for the comrades of our delegation through the Winter Palace, where you can see the Czar lift. See how the Czar lived, an easy visualized lesson in class tyranny." And then the peasant mumbled in his blonde beard, "Now about that grain shortage matter, comrade. Then after the excursion, we have a special lecture arranged for you on the doom of capitalism." When the comrade peasant left, Nina and Tina snooped cautiously around the place where he had stood, inspecting the wooden railing. Once Kira saw Nina cracking something on her thumbnail. This morning on her way up to the office, Kira stopped on the stair, landing and looked at the wall newspaper. The House of the Peasant, like all institutions, had a wall newspaper written by employees, edited by the local communist cell, pasted in a prominent spot for all comrades to read. The wall newspapers were to stimulate the social spirit and consciousness of collective activity. They were devoted to local news of social importance and constructive proletarian criticism. The wall newspaper of the House of the Peasant was a square meter of typewritten strips pasted on a blackboard with headlines in red and blue pencil. There was a prominent editorial on what each one of us comrades here does for the clamping. There was a humorous article on how we'll puncture the foreign imperialists' belly. There was a poem by a local poet about the rhythm of toil. There was a cartoon by a local artist representing a fat man in high silk hat sitting on a toilet. There were many items of constructive proletarian criticism. Comrade Nadia Sharnova is wearing silk stockings. Time to be reminded that such flaunting of luxury is unproletarian. Comrade Sharnova, a certain comrade in a high position has lately allowed his position to go to his head. He has been known to be curt and rude to young members of the Komsomol. This is a warning, comrade. Many a better head had been known to fall when the time came for a reduction of staffs. Comrade E. Ovsov indulges in too much talk when asked about business. This leads to a waste of valuable time and is not at all in the spirit of proletarian efficiency. A certain comrade whom many will recognize neglects to turn off the light when leaving the restroom. Electricity cost monies to the Soviet state, comrade. We hear that Comrade Kira Argonova is lacking in social spirit. The time is past, Comrade Argonova, for arrogant bourgeois attitudes. She stood very still and heard her heart beating. No one dared to ignore the mighty pointing finger of the wall newspaper. All watched it carefully and a little nervously. All bowed reverently to its verdict, from Nina and Tina up to Comrade Voronov himself. The wall newspaper was the voice of social activity. No one could save those branded as anti-social element, not even Andrei Kraganov. There had been talk of a reduction of staff. Kira felt cold. Kira thought that Leo had had nothing but millet for dinner the night before. She thought of Leo's cough. At her desk, she watched the others in the room, wondering who had reported her to the wall newspaper, who and why. She had been so very careful. She had never uttered a word of criticism against the Soviets. She had been as loyally enthusiastic in her work as Comrade Bityuk herself, or as nearly as she could imitate her. She had been careful never to argue, nor to answer sharply, nor to make any enemy of anyone. Her fingers counted rapidly volumes of the works of Karl Marx. She asked herself helplessly, desperately, am I still different? Am I different from them? How do they know I am different? What have I done? What is it I haven't done? When Comrade Bityuk left the office, which happened frequently, work stopped. The staff congregated around Tina's typewriter. There were eager whispers, conferences about the cooperative that gave the loveliest printed calico, that made the loveliest blouses, about the Nepman's stand in the market that sold cotton stockings, so thin it's just like silk, and about lovers, particularly Tina's lovers. Tina was considered the prettiest in the office and the most successful with men. No one had ever seen Little Nose without its whitish coat of powder. There was a strong suspicion in the office that she blackened her eyelashes, and several different masculine figures had been seen waiting to take her home after work. The girl with the leather jacket, being a party member, was the undisputed leader and final authority in all their discussions, but in matter of romances, she conceded first rank to Tina. She listened with a superior, condescending smile that did not hide her eager curiosity, while Tina whispered breathlessly. And Mishka rang the bell, and here was Ivashka in his underdrawers, and I hear Elena Maximovna, that's the tenant in the next room, I hear Elena Maximovna say, a guest for you, Tina. And before I know it, here's Mishka walking right in, and Ivashka in his underdrawers. And you should have seen Mishka's face. Honest, it was better than a comedy show. And I think quick, and I say, Mishka dear, this is Ivan, the neighbor. He lives with Elena Maximovna, and he wasn't feeling so well, so he came in for an aspirin tablet. And you should have seen Ivashka's face. And Elena Maximovna says, sure, he lives with me. Come on back to my room, darling. And do you think that louse Ivashka refused? The young man, who was a party candidate, did not join these conversations but stayed modestly at his desk, listening intently and remarking once in a while, yes, comrades, women, I bet you say things that a serious citizen who is a party candidate shouldn't even hear. They giggled, flattered, and rewarded him with friendly glances. Kira stayed at her desk and went on with her work and did not listen. She never talked to anyone outside of business matters. If any glances were thrown at her occasionally, they were not friendly. She wondered with a cold feeling of panic whether there was what they resented, whether that was her arrogant Burgoy's attitude. She needed this job. Leo needed this job. She made up her mind to keep it. She would keep it. She rose and walked cautiously to Tina's desk. The little group noticed her presence by a few cold, astonished glances and went on with their whisper. She waited for a pause and said suddenly, irrelevantly, forcing all of the artificial enthusiasm she has learned into her flat, unsteady voice. Funny thing happened last night. My boyfriend, he quarreled with me because he had seen me coming home with another man, and he bowled me out terribly, and I told him it was an old-fashioned Burgoy's attitude of proprietorship. He quarreled with me. She felt her blouse sticking to the cold spot between her shoulder blades. She tried to make her voice as gaily flippant as Tina's. She tried to believe the story she was invented. It was inventing. It was strange to think of the fantastic boyfriend offered to the toes prying, hostile eyes, and of the Leo whom Irina had drawn naked as a god. And he bowled me out terribly. Uh huh, said Nina. The girl in the leather jacket said nothing. In the Koznetsky market, said Tina, I have seen them selling lipstick, the new Soviet lipstick of the Cosmetic Trust. Cheap too, only they say it's dangerous to use it. It's made from horse fat and the horses die of Flanders. At 12:30, the office closed for lunch. At 12:25, Comrade Bityuk said, I shall remind you once more, comrades, that at 1:30, instead of reporting back to the office, you are to report at the Smolny Institute to take part in the demonstration of all the workers of Petrograd in honor of the delegation of the British trade unions. The office will be closed this afternoon. Kira spent her lunch hour standing in line at the cooperative to get bread on her employee's ration card. She stood motionless in a blank stupor. A movement or a thought seemed too far away, far in a world where she did not belong any longer. The locks of her hair under her old hat were white with frost. She thought that somewhere beyond all these many things which did not count was her life and Leo. She closed her eyes for one swift second of rest with nothing but his name. Then she opened her eyes and watched dully through lids heavy with white frosted lashes, puffy sparrows picking horse dung in the snow. She had brought her lunch with her, a piece of dried fish wrapped in paper. She ate it because she knew she had to eat. When she got the bread, a 2-pound brown square that was still fresh, she smelled its comforting warm odor and chewed slowly a piece of crust. The rest, tucked firmly under her arm, was for Leo. She ran after a tramway and leaped on just in time for the long ride to the Smolny Institute at the other end of the city for the demonstration of all the workers of Petrograd in honor of the delegation of the British trade unions. Nevsky looked as if it were a solid spread of heads motionless on a huge belt that rolled slowly, carrying them forward. It looked as if red banners swollen like sails between two poles were swimming slowly over motionless heads, the same heads of khaki caps, fur caps, red kerchiefs, hats, khaki caps, red kerchiefs. A dull beating filled the street from wall to wall, up to the roofs, the crunching, creaking, drumming roll of many feet against frozen cobblestones. Tramways stopped and tugged, and trucks waited on corners to let the demonstration pass. A few heads appeared at windows, stared indifferently at the heads below, and disappeared again. Petrograd was used to demonstrations. We toilers of Petrograd greet our British class brothers. Welcome to the land of the Soviets where labor is free. The women of the state textile plant number 2 pledged their support to England's proletariat in its struggle with imperialists. Kira marched between Nina and Comrade Bityuk. Comrade Bityuk had changed her hat to a red kerchief for the occasion. Kira marched steadily, shoulders thrown back, head high. She had to march here to keep her job. She had to keep her job for Leo. She was not a traitor. She was marching for Leo. Even though the banner above her, carried by Nina and party candidates, said, We Soviet peasants stand as one for our British class brothers. Kira could not feel her feet any longer, but she knew that she was walking, for she was moving ahead like the others. Her hands felt as if her mittens were filled with boiling water. She had to walk. She was walking. Somewhere in the long snake that uncoiled slowly down Nevsky, someone's hoarse, loud voice began to sing the Internationale. Others joined. It rolled in raucous, discordant waves down the long column of weary throats choked by frost. On the palace square, now called Square of Uritsky, a wooden amphitheater had been erected. Against the red walls and mirror like windows of the Winter Palace, on the wooden stand draped in red bunting, stood the delegation of the British trade unions. The workers of Petrograd slowly marched past. The British class brothers stood, a little stiff, a little embarrassed, a little bewildered. Kira's eyes saw but one person, the woman delegate of the British trade unions. She was tall, thin, not young, with the worried face of a school teacher, but she wore a tan sports coat, and the coat yelled louder than the hurrahs of the crowd, louder than the Internationale, that it was foreign, with firm, pressed folds of rich material, trim, well fitted, serene. That coat did not moan, like all those others around Kira, of the misery of the muscles underneath. The British comrade wore silk stockings, a rich brownish sheen, tight on feet in trim, new well polished brown shoes. And suddenly Kira wanted to scream and to hurl herself at the stand and to grab these thin, glittering legs and hang on with her teeth as to an anchor and be carried away with them into their world, which was possible somewhere, which was now here, close, within hearing of a cry for help. But she only swayed a little and closed her eyes. The demonstration stopped. It stood knocking heels together to keep warm, listening to speeches. There were many speeches. The comrade woman of the British Trade Union spoke. A hoarse interpreter bellowed her words into the square, red and khaki, with heads packed tightly together. This is a thrilling sight. We were sent here by England's workers to see for ourselves and to tell the world the truth about the great experiment you are conducting. We shall tell them that we saw the great masses of Russian toilers in a free and magnificent expression of loyalty to the Soviet government. For one insane second, Kira wondered if she could tear through the crowd, rush up to that woman and yell to her, to England's worker, to the world, that truth they were seeking. But she thought of Leo at home, marble pale, coughing. It was Leo against the truth to a world which would not listen. Leo won. At 5 p.m., a glistening limousine whisked the delegates away and the demonstration broke up. It was growing dark. Kira had time for her lecture at the institute. The cold, badly lighted auditoriums were a tonic to her, with the charts, drafts, and prints on the walls showing beams and griders and cross sections that looked precise, impersonal, and unsullied. For a short hour, even though her stomach throbbed with hunger, she could remember that she was to be a builder who would build aluminium bridges and towers of steel and glass, and that there was a future. After the lecture, hurrying out through dim corridors, she met Comrade Sonia. Ah, Comrade Argonova, said Comrade Sonia. We haven't seen you for a long time. Not so active in your studies anymore, are you? And as to social activity, why, you are the most privately individualistic student we have got. Kira began. None of my business, Comrade Argonova. I know, none of my business. I was just thinking of things one hears nowadays about things the party may do, but students who are not social minded don't give it a thought. You see, Kira knew it wiser to explain. I'm working, and I'm very active socially in our Marxist club. So, you are you? We know you, Burgoyes. All you are active for is to keep your measly jobs. You're not fooling anyone. When Kira entered the room, Marisha jumped up like a spring unwinding. Citizen Argonova, you keep your damn cat in your own room or I'll wring her neck. My cat? What cat? I have no cat. Well, who's done this? Your boyfriend? Marisha was pointing to a puddle in the middle of her room. And what's that? An elephant. She raised a meow and a pair of grey, furry ears emerged from under a chair. It's not my cat, said Kira. Where has she come from then? How do I know? You never know anything. Kira did not answer and went to her room. She heard Marisha in the little hall of the lobby, pounding at the partition that separated them from the other tenants. She heard her yelling, "Hey, you there! Your goddamn cat's torn a board loose, and here she is, crapping all over the place. You take her away, or I'll gut her alive and report you to the Apravdom." Leo was not home. The room was dark, cold as a cellar. Kira switched on the light. The bed was not made. The blanket was on the floor. She lighted the burgoyes, blowing at the damp logs. Her eyes swelling. The pipes were leaking. She hung a tin can on a wire to catch the dripping soot. She pumped the Primus. It would not light. Its tubes were clogged again. She searched all over the room for the special wire cleaner. She could not find it. She knocked at the door. "Citizen Lavrova, have you taken any Primus cleaner again?" There was no answer. She flung the door open. "Citizen Lavrova, have you taken my Primus cleaner?" "Oh, hell," said Marisha. "Stingy, aren't you, of a little Primus cleaner? Here it is. How many times do I have to ask you, Citizen Lavrova, not to touch any of my things in my absence? What are you going to do about it? Report me?" Kira took the Primus cleaner and slammed the door. She was peeling potatoes when Leo came in. "Oh," he said, "you are home." "Yes, where have you been, Leo? Any of your business?" She did not answer. His shoulders were drooping and his lips were blue. She knew where he had been and that he had not succeeded. She went on peeling the potatoes. He stood with his hands extended to the burgoyes, his lips twisted with pain. He coughed, then he turned abruptly and said, "Same thing, since 8 this morning. No opening, no job, no work." "It's all right, Leo. We don't have to worry." "No, we don't, do we? You're enjoying it, aren't you, to see me living off you? You're glad to remind me that I don't have to worry while you're working yourself into a scarecrow of a martyr." "Leo!" "Well, I don't want to see you work. I don't want to see you cook. I don't—" "Oh, Kira." He seized her and put his head on her shoulder and buried his face in her neck, over the blue flame of the Primus. "Kira, you forgive me, don't you?" She patted his hair with her cheeks, for her hands were sticky with potato peelings. "Of course, dearest. Why don't you lie down and rest? Dinner will be ready in just a little while. Why don't you let me help you? Now there's an argument that we have closed long ago." He bent down to her, lifting her chin. She whispered, shuddering a little, "Don't, Leo. Don't kiss me here." She held out her dirty hands over the Primus. He did not kiss her. A bitter little smile of understanding jerked one corner of his mouth. He walked to the bed and fell down. He lay so still, his head thrown back, one arm hanging to the floor, that she felt uncomfortable. Once in a while she called softly, "Leo," just to see him open his eyes. Then she wished she hadn't called. She did not want his eyes to stay open, watching her fixedly. She who had so carefully closed the door between them so that he might not see her as she did not want to be seen. She stood before him now, bent over a Primus in an aura of kerosene and onion smell, her hands slimy with raw mud, her hair hanging down in sticky strands over a nose shiny without powder, her eyes and nostrils red on a white face, her body sagging limply under a filthy apron. She had no time to wash, her movements heavy and slurred, not the sharp play of muscles, but the soulful, slothful fall of limbs pushed by a weariness beyond control. And when dinner was ready and they sat facing each other across the table, she thought with a pain which would not become a habit that he, whom she wanted to face, looking young, erect, vibrant with all of her worship, he now looked into her eyes, into eyes swollen with smoke, and at a pale mouth that smiled an effort she could not hide. They had millet, potatoes, and onion fried in linseed oil. She was so hungry that her arms were limp, but she could not touch the millet. She felt suddenly an uncontrollable revulsion, a hatred that could let her starve rather than swallow one more spoonful of the bitter stuff she had eaten. It seemed all her life she wondered dully whether there was a place on earth where one could eat without being sick of every mouthful, a place where eggs and butters and sugar were not a sublime ideal longed for agonizingly, never attained. She washed the dishes in cold water, grease floating over the pan. Then she pulled on her felt boots. "I have to go out, Leo," she said with resignation. "It's the Marxist club tonight. Social activity. He did not answer. He did not look at her as she went out. The Marxist Club held its session in the library of the House of the Peasant. The library was like all the other rooms in the building except that it had more posters and fewer books. The books were lined on shelves instead of being stacked in tall columns ready for shipping. The girl in the leather jacket was chairman of the club. The employees of the House of the Peasant were members. The club was dedicated to political self education and the study of historical revolutionary philosophy. It met twice a week. One member read a thesis he had prepared, the others discussed it. It was Kira's turn. She read her thesis on Marxism and Leninism. Leninism is Marxism adapted to Russian reality. Karl Marx, the great founder of communism, believed that socialism was to be the logical outcome of capitalism. In a country of highly developed industrialism and with a proletariat attuned to a high degree of class consciousness. But our great leader, Comrade Lenin, proved that. She had copied her thesis, barely changing the words from the ABC of Communism, a book whose study was compulsory in every school in the country. She knew that all her listeners had read it and that they had also read her thesis time and time again in every editorial of every newspaper for the last 6 years. They sat around her hunched, legs stretched out limply, shivering in their overcoats. They knew she was there for the same reason as they were. The girl in the leather jacket presided, yawning once in a while. When Kira finished, a few hands clapped drowsily. Who desires to make comments, comrades? The chairman inquired. A young girl with a very round face and forlorn eyes said, lisping, showing eagerly her active interest. I think it was a very nice thesis and very valuable and instructive because it was very nice and clear and explained a valuable new theory. A consumptive and intellectual young man with blue eyelids and a pince-nez said in the professional manner of a scientist, I would make the following criticism, Comrade Argonova, when you speak of the fact that Comrade Lenin allowed a place for the peasant beside the industrial workers in the scheme of communism, you should specify that it is a poor peasant, not just any kind of a peasant, because it is well known that there are rich peasants in the villages who are hostile to Leninism. Kira knew that she had to argue and defend her thesis. She knew that the consumptive young man had to argue to show his activity. She knew that he was no more interested in the discussion than she was, that his blue eyelids were weary with sleeplessness, that he clasped his thin hands nervously, not daring to glance at his wristwatch, not daring to let his thoughts wander to the home and its cares that awaited him somewhere. She said dully, when I mention the peasant beside the worker in Comrade Lenin's theory, it is to be taken for granted that I mean the poor peasant as no other has a place in communism. The young man said drowsily, Yes, but I think we should be scientifically methodical and say poor peasant. The chairman said, I agree with the last speaker. The thesis should be corrected to read poor peasant. Any other comment, comrades? There were none. We shall thank Comrade Argonova for her valuable work, said the chairman. Our next meeting will be devoted to a thesis by Comrade Leskov on Marxism and collectivism. I now declare this meeting closed. With a convulsive jerk and a clatter of chairs, they rushed out of the library, down the dark stairs into the dark streets. They had done their duty, the evening down those dark stairs. The evening, or what was left of it, belonged to them now. Kira walked fast and listened to her own footsteps, listened blankly without thought. She could think now, but after so many hours of such a tremendous effort not to think, to remember only not to think, thoughts seemed slow to return. She knew only that her steps were beating, fast, firm, precise, until their strength and their hope rose to her body, to her heart, to the throbbing haze in her temples. She threw her head back as if she were resting, swimming on her back, close under a clear black sky, with stars at the tip of her nose and rooftops with snow clean in the frozen straight like white virgin mountain peaks. Then she swung forward with the sharp, light movements of Kira Argonova's body, and she whispered to herself, as she had talked to herself often in the last 2 months, well, it's war. It's war. You don't give up, do you, Kira? It's not dangerous so long as you don't give up. And the harder it gets, the happier you should be that you can stand it. That's it. The harder, the happier. It's war. You are a good soldier, Kira Argonova. When Leo put his arms around her and whispered into her hair, Oh yes, yes, Kira, tonight, please. She knew that she could not refuse any longer. Her body, suddenly limp again, cried for nothing but sleep. An endless sleep. It horrified her, that reluctant surrender, numb, lifeless, without response. He held her body close to his, and his skin was warm under the cold blanket. His skin was warm and soothing, and she closed her eyes. What's the matter, Kira? She smiled and forced all her last strength into her lips in the hollow of his collarbone. Into her arms locked around his body, her arms relaxed and one hand slipped, soft and weak, over the edge of the bed. She jerked her eyes open. She loved him. She wanted him. She wanted to want him. She screamed to herself almost aloud. He was kissing her body, but she was thinking of what they thought of her thesis, of Tina and the girls in the leather jacket, of the probable reduction of staffs, and suddenly she was seized with revulsion of his soft, hungry lips, because something in her, or of her, or around her was too unworthy of him. But she could keep awake a little while longer, and she stiffened her body for an ordeal. All her thoughts of love reduced to a tortured hurry to get it over with. It was past midnight, and she did not know whether she had been asleep or not. Leo breathed painfully on the pillow beside her, his forehead clammy with cold perspiration. In the haze of her mind, one thought stood out clearly. The apron. That apron of her was filthy. It was loathsome. She could not let Leo see her wearing it another day. Not another day. She crawled out of bed and slipped her coat over her nightgown. It was too cold and she was too tired to dress. She put the pan of cold water on the bathroom floor and fell down by its side and crammed the apron, the soap, and her hands into a liquid that felt like acid. She did not know whether she was quite awake, and she did not care. She knew only that the big yellow grease spot wouldn't come off, and she rubbed and she rubbed and she rubbed with dry, acrid yellow soap with her nails and her knuckles, soap studs on the fur cuffs of the coat, huddled on the floor, her breast panting against the thin edge of the pan, her hair falling down into the suds, beyond the narrow cracks of the bathroom door, a tall blue window sparkling with frost, her knuckles raw, the skin rubbed off. Beyond the bedroom door, someone in Marisha's room playing John Gray on a piano with a missing key. The pain growing in her back, the soap suds brown and greasy over purple hands. They saved the money for many months, and on a Sunday evening they brought 2 tickets to see Bajadere, advertised as the latest sensation of Vienna, Berlin and Paris. They sat solemn, erect, reverent as at a church service, Kira a little paler than usual in her grey silk dress, Leo trying not to cough, and they listened to the Vantonist operetta from over there from abroad. It was very gay nonsense. It was like a glance straight through the snow and the flax, through the border into the heart of that other world. There were colored lights and spangles and crystal goblets in a real foreign bar with a dull glass archway where a green light moved slowly upward, preceding every entrance. A real foreign elevator. There were women in shimmering satin from a place where fashions existed, and people dancing a funny foreign dance called shimmy, and a woman who did not sing but barked words out, spitting them contemptuously at the audience in a flat, hoarse voice that trailed suddenly into a husky moan, and a music that laughed defiantly, panting, gasping, hitting one's ear and throat and breath, an impudent, drunken music like the challenge of a triumphant gaiety, like the song of broken glass, a promise that existed somewhere, that could be. The public laughed and applauded and laughed when the lights went on after the final curtain. In the procession of cheerful grins down the aisles, many noticed with astonishment a girl in a grey silk dress, who sat in an emptying row, bent over, her face in her hands, sobbing. That brings us to the end of our chapter 15. We will be reading chapter 16 in our next recording. If you have any kind of feedback, positive or negative, any suggestions, any recommendations, anything at all, you can reach out to me in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section of the YouTube channel. If you have not subscribed yet, do subscribe, like and share. Bye bye for now. Keep reading. Bye.